The forest had no business being that beautiful on the night everything changed. The Ashwood stretched dark and ancient in every direction, its trees older than memory. Their roots sunk so deep into the earth that the ground itself seemed to breathe differently here. Slower, heavier, like something enormous was sleeping just beneath the surface and had been sleeping for a very long time. Lyra Finch pressed her back against the oak tree and told herself, for the 4th time in 20 minutes, to leave. She didn't leave. She could see the clearing from where she stood, just barely, through the gaps between the trees, through the dark and the distance, and the thick curtain of her own better judgment. 4 enormous bonfires burned at the corners of a stone circle, throwing gold and copper light in every direction. The flames didn't flicker the way ordinary fires did. They moved like something alive, like they were breathing in rhythm with the drums. The drums. She had heard drums before. Festival drums, celebration drums, the kind that rang out from the castle courtyard on feast days, and made the younger servants dance in the kitchen when Lady Gundred wasn't watching. Those drums were cheerful things, simple things. These were different. These didn't ask to be heard. They simply entered you, through the soles of your feet, up through your legs, settling into the space behind your ribs before your ears had finished deciding what they were. Every beat landed in Lyra's chest like a second heartbeat, like the forest had one, and she had stumbled into it, and now her body was trying to match it without her permission. Leave, she told herself, right now. Turn around and walk back the way you came, and forget you were ever here. The drums answered her with another beat. She stayed. Through the gaps in the trees, she could see them. Hundreds of people gathered inside and around that stone circle, their faces painted gold by the firelight. The entire Doolin pack. She had never seen so many people in one place who were all so completely still. Not frozen. Not waiting, exactly. More like present. The way a forest is present. Fully, completely, without distraction. In the center of the circle, she could see the women who had volunteered. 12 of them, standing in a single line, dressed in white that caught the firelight and turned warm and golden. They were still 2, their hands at their sides, their faces forward. Waiting. Lyra understood, as in the way you understand something your body knows before your mind catches up, that she was watching something sacred, something that had been happening in this clearing, on this night, under this particular moon, for longer than anyone currently alive could remember. The weight of it pressed against her, even from the tree line, even from behind an oak trunk, even from the safe and cowardly distance of someone who had absolutely no right to be there. She pressed herself flatter against the bark, and then the drums struck 3 times, louder, deeper, different, and the crowd shifted without a word, opening a path from the eastern edge of the circle, and Alpha King Marmon Richmond walked in. Lyra had heard the other servants talk about him. Of course she had. Her servants' quarters were small, and nights were long, and conversation filled the space that sleep couldn't, especially when the wine ran out and the candle was burning low. She had heard every version of him. The height, the eyes, the way a room adjusted around his presence, the way a river adjusts around a stone, not because the stone commands it, but because it simply cannot do otherwise. She had listened to all of it with the mild interest of someone cataloguing information that had no practical use for them. Nothing she had heard prepared her for this. He moved through the path the crowd made for him, the way water moves, without force, without performance, with the absolute unhurried ease of something that has never once in its existence needed to prove that it was moving. He was tall in a way that was almost unfair, or broad through the shoulders, his dark hair pulled back, the firelight catching the edges of it and turning them copper. He wore no ceremony, no crown, no formal robe, nothing that announced what he was. He didn't need any of it. You knew what he was the way you know what a storm is, not from any single sign, but from the way the air changes before it arrives. He reached the center of the circle. He stopped, and the silence that fell over that clearing was so complete that Lyra could hear her own breathing, much too loud, much too fast, against the bark of the oak tree 30 yards away. He turned slowly, taking in the women in the circle. The elders watched from the northern edge, still as carved stone. The drum settled into a low, steady rhythm, barely there now, just enough to mark time. A heartbeat, a breath. While Marmon began to walk, each step was slow and deliberate, pausing before each woman in the line, his body angled slightly forward, his head tilting at small, careful angles, reading the air. The wolf doing what the man was standing back to let it do. The ritual made flesh and instinct and ancient law. It isn't the man who decides, Lyra thought, remembering what Maybelle had said in the servant quarters the week before, her voice low and impressed the way it always got when she was about to say something she wasn't supposed to know. It's the wolf. The wolf was deciding now. She could feel it from the tree line, something enormous and patient moving inside him. Something older than he was, older than the castle, older than the law that governed this ceremony. It pressed against the air the way the drums pressed against her chest, slowly, inevitably. Marmon paused before the third woman in the line, a long pause. The crowd around the circle held their collective breath. He moved on. He paused before the seventh, shorter. He moved on. He was halfway through the line, and Lyra had almost convinced herself, almost, that her presence here was invisible enough, inconsequential enough, small enough to go unnoticed, even by whatever ancient instinct was currently steering the most powerful alpha in 3 kingdoms through a sacred ceremony she had no right to witness. She had almost convinced herself. And then he stopped. Not the considered, searching pause he had given the women in the circle. This was different. This was the stop of something that has heard a sound no one else can detect. A sudden, total stillness, like a fault line catching before the ground moves. His shoulders rose on a slow inhale, his spine straightened, his head tilted to the side at an angle that had nothing human left in it. The angle of something that hunts, that reads the air before it reads anything else. His nostrils flared, the drums kept beating. Lyra stopped breathing entirely. His head turned, slowly, with the kind of certainty that doesn't need to search, because it already knows where it is looking before it looks. His golden eyes found hers through the trees, through the dark, through 30 yards of forest and shadow, and every logical reason why that should have been impossible. They found her the way a key finds a lock, not searching, arriving. Lyra ran. Chapter 1. The Losing Bet. She had not meant to be in the Ashwood that night, and that was the truth, the plain, unglamorous truth that had no heroism in it, and no destiny, and no grand narrative of a girl who felt the pull of something ancient and followed it bravely into the dark. The truth was a bucket competition, a lost bet, and a dare that Kathleen Voss had designed specifically to be impossible to refuse, while also being entirely Lyra's fault for accepting. The morning had started the way all mornings at Lady Gundred's estate started, before the sun, before the bell, before any of the other servants were awake enough to be fully human yet. Lyra was already dressed, and moving through the cold stone corridors with a candle that barely pushed back the dark, her worn shoes silent on the flagstones, her mind running through the day's work the way it always did. The eastern courtyard needed scrubbing, or the guest linens hadn't been pressed since the last visitors left. The kitchen fire needed banking before Harlan McGraw arrived to start breakfast and found it cold, which he would mention to Lady Gundred in that specific tone of his that managed to carry blame without ever technically assigning it. She filled the first water bucket at the eastern well while the sky was still deep grey. This was her life, and she understood it clearly. Not good, not terrible, not the life anyone would choose if choosing were an option, but a life that was hers in the sense that she knew its edges. She knew which floorboards in the upper corridor creaked and should be avoided when Lady Gundred had a headache. She knew that the third gate guard, Rufus Haskins, would look the other way if you brought him something warm from the kitchen on a cold morning. Or she knew that the north battlement was empty between the third and fourth guard rounds, and that if you climbed the narrow staircase and stood at the parapet and looked out over the Ashwood, you could breathe without performing anything at all. She had been here since she was 8 years old, 23 now, which meant 15 years of learning the particular art of invisibility, of being useful enough to keep and small enough to be safe, of wanting very little because wanting led to disappointment, and disappointment led to the kind of sadness that was hard to work around when you had floors to scrub at 4 in the morning. She was good at it. The invisibility. She had become excellent at it. The bucket competition had started the way most of Kathleen's bad ideas started, with someone being bored on an afternoon when the regular work was done early and the extra work hadn't been assigned yet. That particular gap of freedom, Lyra had learned, was more dangerous than any amount of labor. "Race," Kathleen said, appearing at the well with her empty bucket, and that particular light in her eyes that meant she had already thought through the idea far more carefully than she was letting on. "Whoever fills the most buckets before the dinner bell wins." Lorena Cross looked up from her mending on the low stone wall nearby. "Wins what?" "The loser's punishment," Kathleen said. Lorena and Lyra exchanged a look. The thing about Kathleen Voss was that she was genuinely warm, generous with her laughter, to loyal in the particular fierce way of someone who has not had much to be loyal to and has decided to make the most of what she has. She was also almost completely unable to resist the engineering of small disasters. She didn't mean harm by it. She simply had a very high tolerance for consequences that weren't hers. "What's the punishment?" Lyra asked, because she had learned that not asking was always worse. Kathleen smiled. It was a very specific smile, the smile of someone who already knows the outcome. "Whoever loses," Kathleen said, "goes to the Ashwood tonight, watches the claiming ceremony, comes back and tells us everything." The silence that followed had weight. Lorena set down her mending very carefully. Everyone at Lady Gundred's estate knew about the claiming ceremony, the way everyone in the kingdom knew about it. In the way you know about storms coming in from the east, or the deep current in the river below the mill that has taken people before and will take them again. The claiming happened on the first full moon of every spring. The entire Doolin pack gathered in the Ashwood clearing. The Alpha King walked among the women who had chosen to stand in the sacred circle, and his wolf, not his mind, his will, his preference, chose the woman it recognized as his mate. No one outside the pack attended, no outsiders, no servants. No one who hadn't been invited stood within sight of that clearing on that night, because the sacred was not the same thing as the welcoming, and the pack had laws about both. "Now that is an extraordinarily bad idea," Lorena said. It would need to be someone very quiet, Kathleen agreed pleasantly, and very good at not being noticed. She looked at Lyra. Lyra looked back at her. No, you haven't lost yet. I'm not going to lose. She lost. She lost badly and completely, and the particular injustice of it was that she had been carrying water since she was 8 years old, and should have won without any effort at all. And instead, the dinner bell rang, while she was still 3 buckets behind Kathleen, who had apparently been practicing at a well Lyra didn't know about, or had been blessed with supernatural bucket-filling ability, or had simply cheated in a way Lyra hadn't caught. She stood beside the well with her losing total of buckets, and looked at Kathleen's winning smile and said, or with the resignation of someone who has accepted that today is going to end poorly, I am going to regret this. Probably, Kathleen agreed. And that was how Lyra Finch, who had spent 15 years becoming invisible, ended up pressing her back against an oak tree at the edge of the most sacred ceremony in the Doolin Pack's history, with mud on her knees and her heart trying to exit her chest, while the most powerful alpha in 3 kingdoms stood in the middle of a stone circle and inhaled, and found her. She ran. The forest at night is not the forest in the daytime. She had known the paths around the estate her entire life. She could walk them in the dark, in rain, half asleep. But the Ashwood at night on the first full moon of spring was not the same geography. The trees were the same trees, the roots were the same roots. But something had shifted in the air, some weight that turned ordinary dark into something denser, and her feet, which should have known exactly where they were going, found every root and every hollow that the ground had to offer. She was running. She was running fast. She was also running with no plan and no direction, and the particular single-mindedness of someone whose entire operating consciousness had narrowed down to a way. Her right foot found the root before she found it. The world tipped sideways. She grabbed for branches and found air. The slope opened beneath her, invisible in the dark, covered in wet leaves and slick moss, and she went down it the way water goes down a hill, without any input from her own preferences, entirely committed to the descent, bouncing off things she couldn't see and would feel tomorrow. The oak tree at the bottom of the slope stopped her. Not gently. The entire left side of her body hit the trunk with a force that knocked everything out of her lungs at once, and for several long, humiliating seconds, she lay on the cold earth on her side, with her mouth open, and no sound coming out, and the moon looking down at her through the canopy with what felt like a very personal interest in her suffering. The air came back in a long, painful pull. With it came every ache at once, her shoulder, her ribs, her knees, the palm of her left hand that had tried to break the fall and had contributed very little, except new injury. She lay still for a moment, her cheek against the wet leaves, breathing carefully because deep breaths reminded her ribs of what had just happened to them. You lost a bucket race, she thought, or staring at the dark ground. And now you are lying in the Ashwood at night with your ribs screaming and absolutely no idea which direction leads home. Excellent, excellent work. She lay there for a while she couldn't measure. Eventually, the dizziness eased enough that sitting up seemed possible. When she finally managed it, the moon had dropped lower in the sky, and the distant drums had gone completely silent, and she was alone in the dark forest, with nothing but the sounds of small things moving in the undergrowth and the complete absence of any useful landmark. She began walking in the direction that seemed most likely to be right. It wasn't. She arrived back at the estate as dawn was thinking about beginning, muddy, limping slightly, her left sleeve torn from shoulder to elbow, her ribs lodging a formal complaint every time she breathed too deeply. The back gate was unlocked, as she had left it. The servants' staircase was empty, The corridor was dark. She pushed open the door to the room she shared with Kathleen and Lorena, and found both of them sitting up on their cots with a single candle burning between them, wearing the expressions of people who had been waiting for something and were now uncertain whether to be relieved or alarmed. "You were gone all day," Lorena said carefully. "I fell on a slope." Lyra dropped onto her cot and began pulling off her ruined shoe. "I got lost on the way back." Kathleen was staring at the torn sleeve, the mud, the way Lyra was sitting very carefully to avoid moving her ribs unnecessarily. "Are you?" "I'm fine." A pause. "My shoulder disagrees." But I'm fine." Lorena said nothing for a moment. Then, quietly, "People are talking." Lyra looked up. "About the claiming." Lorena pulled her knees to her chest, the way she did when she was working up to saying something difficult. "My aunt was there. She said," a pause, "she said she has never seen anything like it." The Alpha King stopped in the middle of the ceremony. Not the slow stop he uses when he's considering the women in the circle. Something different. Sudden. Like, she searched for the word, like something invisible caught him. The room was very quiet. She said he tried to leave the circle. Twice. The guards held him back. Lorena looked at Lyra carefully. And then he shifted, right there, in front of the whole pack, and ran into the Ashwood. The silence stretched. Kathleen was looking at Lyra with an expression Lyra couldn't entirely read. "Could it have been—" she started. "No." The word came out flat and immediate. "I'm a servant. I'm human. It wasn't me." Kathleen and Lorena exchanged a look. Then Kathleen laughed, the laugh of someone who has decided the idea is too absurd to take seriously, which was exactly the correct response, which was exactly what Lyra needed. Lorena smiled, and the tension in the room dissolved into the warm, easy thing it usually was. They blew out the candle. Lyra lay on her back in the dark and stared at the ceiling. Her ribs hurt. Her shoulder hurt. Her heart had still not returned to its normal rhythm. She closed her eyes. Behind them, in the absolute dark of her own mind, she saw golden eyes finding hers through the trees with the precision of something that already knew exactly where to look. She opened her eyes again and stared at the ceiling for a very long time. Chapter 2. The Ceremony. She had almost convinced herself by the third day that nothing had happened. Not nothing. She wasn't capable of quite that much self-deception. Something had happened. A strange night in the Ashwood, a fall, a long walk home, eyes across a distance that was too large for eyes to cross, the kind of thing that could be filed under strange experience and left there, sealed shut, not looked at again. She was good at not looking at things. She had been scrubbing the eastern courtyard stones for an hour before the cold of the morning settled into her fully, the worn brush moving in its usual rhythm, or the dirty water turning darker in the bucket beside her, her mind running through nothing in particular, the deliberate kind of nothing that is its own form of work, the emptying out that keeps you functional when you spend your days in other people's spaces. The shiver came before the sound. Not a cold shiver. Something else, a change in the weight of the air, a shift in pressure that her body noticed before she could name it. It was the same sensation she had felt at the edge of the Ashwood clearing, something enormous and old pressing against the ordinary world from the outside. She kept her brush moving on the stones. The gate guard's voice lifted above the courtyard in the particular cadence reserved for visitors who mattered. Alpha King Marmon Richmond of the Doolin Pack. Her hand stopped on the stone. She looked up. It was involuntary. Not a choice, not a decision. The way your hand pulls back from heat before your mind has finished registering warmth. Her eyes lifted from the stones to the gate, to the man riding through it, and the recognition that moved through her was so immediate and so physical that it felt less like seeing and more like impact. He was exactly as she had seen him in the firelight, and he was nothing like she had managed to remember him since. The morning light was less forgiving than firelight, more precise, less theatrical, and in it he was simply, undeniably there in a way that left no room for softening or distance. His eyes found hers across the full width of the courtyard. They found her the same way they had found her in the forest, with that same devastating certainty, that same absence of searching. But he didn't scan the courtyard and arrive at her. He simply looked directly at her, as though she were the only fixed point in the space, and everything else was moving. Lyra's hand released the brush. The dirty water spread across the pale stone in a slow, dark stain she would have to clean again later. Marmon stopped walking. Just stopped. In the middle of the courtyard, between his riders and the main steps where Lady Gundred was descending, with her practiced welcome smile and her finest morning dress, and looked at Lyra with the expression of someone who has been searching for something they cannot name until this exact moment when they find it, and the name arrives fully formed. Lady Gundred's voice drifted down from the steps, warm, gracious, perfectly constructed. "Your Majesty, what an honor to receive you at." Marmon's eyes moved from Lyra to the stairs. He inclined his head. "Lady Gundred." He climbed the steps, and at the last moment, before he reached the top and passed through the main doors, he glanced back over his shoulder, directly, precisely, without any performance of casualness. His voice carried just far enough. "I know exactly who you are." Then he was inside the castle, and the doors closed behind him, and the courtyard returned to its ordinary morning sounds, and Lyra was kneeling beside her spreading puddle of dirty water, with her pulse in her throat, and 5 words rearranging everything she had spent 3 days carefully deciding to believe. She cleaned up the water. She finished the stones. She said nothing to anyone. But that evening she was assigned to serve at the formal dinner Lady Gundred held in Marmon's honour. One of 3 servants working the hall, 2 at the door, and Lyra at the sideboard with the wine pitcher, which was her usual position, because she was quiet and steady and did not spill. She was part of the setting. She was furniture. She was, as she had been, for 15 years, invisible. The hall was beautiful in the way Lady Gundred's formal rooms were always beautiful. Cold and deliberate, every candle placed for maximum effect, every surface polished to the kind of shine that says power in the particular language of people who have always had it. The long table ran nearly the full length of the room. The guests were already seated when Lyra took her position by the sideboard, and she settled into the particular stillness of her work, eyes moving, hands ready, waiting for the first glass to empty. She didn't look toward the door. She felt him when he entered anyway. The conversation in the hall softened in the way it always did, not silenced, just adjusted, the volume dropping 2 degrees without anyone asking it to, the way weather adjusts a room through a window left open. He came in last, moved to his seat at Lady Gundred's right, with the ease of someone who has been the most significant presence in every room they have entered, for as long as rooms have existed, settled into his chair, and picked up the conversation on his left, as though he had been in it the whole time. Lyra watched the wine levels at the far end of the table. She did not look toward his seat. Or the first time she circled the table with the pitcher, she felt his awareness of her movement from across the room. Not looking, not staring, simply present to her, the way a compass needle is present to north. She felt it in the back of her neck as she moved between the chairs, filling glasses, keeping her eyes on the work. She reached his end of the table. His hand rested on the dark wood beside his goblet. Easy, relaxed, fingers spread. She positioned the pitcher, began the pour. The wine ran dark and silent into the goblet, and then his hand moved. A small movement, casual, the kind of adjustment a man makes without thinking, shifting in his chair, resettling his hand on the table. But now his fingers were closer, not touching, just closer. Close enough that she could feel the warmth from his skin before any contact occurred. She held very still inside her own body, the way you hold still when there is something delicate happening, and any movement might disturb it. The wine filled the goblet. She straightened the pitcher. She moved to the next guest, and only then realized she had been holding her breath for the last 30 seconds, and that her hands, which had been steady at this task for years, were not entirely steady. 3 more times she circled the table. 3 more times, when she reached his seat, she felt his attention settle on her before she was close enough to confirm it. Not the evaluating look of a man assessing the person serving his table, not the reflexive courtesy that powerful guests sometimes offered servants the way you might briefly acknowledge a door by opening it. Something else. Something that had nothing of assessment in it and everything of recognition. Stop imagining things, she told herself, on the 3rd pass. The other half of her mind said nothing, which was the more unsettling response. Lady Gundred dismissed her just before the last course, a small, precise gesture, the kind that contained entire conversations in a single motion. Lyra picked up the empty pitcher, walked out of the hall without looking back, and stood in the cold corridor for a moment, with the feeling of someone who has been standing too close to a fire for too long, and is now trying to remember what ordinary temperature feels like. She went to the kitchen. She returned the pitcher. She did her remaining work. And late that night, when the castle had gone quiet and the corridor was empty, and the guard round had passed, as she climbed the narrow northern staircase to the battlement because she needed to breathe, and the battlement was the only place in the entire estate where she could do it without performing anything at all. The night was cold and clear, and the moon was there, as it had been 3 nights ago when she had run through the Ashwood. She stood at the parapet and put her hands on the cold stone and closed her eyes and pulled the night air into her lungs until they ached with it. Better. She kept her eyes closed. "I was wondering," said a voice behind her, low and unhurried, and carrying that particular quality of someone who is not surprised by anything they are currently witnessing, how long it would take. Chapter 3. The battlements. She turned around. He was there, leaning against the opposite parapet with his arms crossed, and his gaze turned toward the dark forest below, like a man who has been standing in a particular place for a while, and has made himself comfortable in it. He didn't look like he had just arrived. He looked like he knew this place, or at least knew that she would come to it. "For what?" Lyra heard herself ask. "For you to come up here." He turned his head toward her slowly. "You couldn't sleep." "I come here often," she said carefully. "I have for years." "I know." He pushed away from the parapet with that unhurried ease, and the distance between them, which had seemed adequate a moment ago, suddenly seemed less so. "I asked about you after dinner. You've been at this estate since you were 8 years old. You have no family. You gave yourself the surname Finch." A pause. "Or you eat breakfast before the morning bell, and you know every guard's routine by heart, and you come up here when you need air." The particular quality of being known by someone who had no right yet to know you was something Lyra had no prior experience of, and it sat in her chest in a way she couldn't categorize. "You had me watched," she said. "I asked questions." His golden eyes were steady on hers. "There's a difference." She held his gaze. "What do you want?" He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved between them, lifting the edge of her shawl. Below, the Ashwood was a dark mass against the lighter dark of the sky. "My wolf stopped the entire ceremony," he said, "because it felt you in the trees." He said it the way people say things they have already decided to say, plainly, without performance, without building toward it. That has not happened before. Not once. Not in any record the elders have. Lyra's hands were very still on the parapet stone. "My wolf didn't hesitate," he continued. "Didn't consider. It turned away from every woman standing in that circle and locked onto a servant girl hiding behind an oak tree 30 yards away." He tilted his head slightly. "That is not a coincidence." "I was there by accident," she said. "I lost a bet." Something moved across his face. Not a smile exactly, but the edge of one. The place just before it. "I know that too." She looked at him and tried to find the right framework for what was happening. She had frameworks for most things. 15 years of observation had given her a comprehensive understanding of how power operated, how kindness and cruelty distributed themselves among the people who had both, how to read what was behind a person's eyes when their face was showing you something else. She did not have a framework for this. For a man who had ridden to a foreign estate and stopped walking in a courtyard because his eyes had found a servant girl on her knees beside a water bucket, and then stood at her parapet in the middle of the night and said plainly, "My wolf chose you." "You came here to marry Lady Gundred," she said. "I came here to break that agreement." She let out a slow breath. "She won't accept that." "That," he said, taking one easy step that somehow completely changed the geometry of the space between them, "is tomorrow's problem." The wind moved again. The moon watched from above. Lyra was aware, with the full, but inconvenient awareness of a person who has just discovered that their body has opinions they were not consulted about, of how warm he was standing this close in the cold before dawn, of how still the wolf in him was, of how his eyes hadn't moved from her face since he turned toward her. "I'm a servant," she said. "I'm not a wolf. I cannot be your mate." He looked at her for a long, quiet moment. "You're telling me what destiny can't do. I'm telling you what I am. I know what you are." He raised one hand slowly enough that she had time to feel every inch of the distance closing, and his fingers rested against her jaw. Just resting. Warm. Careful. Not holding, just present. "I know what you are better than you do right now, and that's going to change." The shiver that moved through her had nothing to do with the cold, or from somewhere below, in the stairwell she had climbed, something shifted in the dark. The smallest sound, the brush of fabric against stone, a careful inhalation. She didn't hear it. Neither did he. The wind carried it away, and the moment continued, suspended and fragile and enormous. She stepped back. Not because she wanted to, because she had 15 years of knowing that things you want and cannot have are better not touched, because touching them makes the wanting worse. "I need to go," she said. He let his hand fall without resistance. He didn't follow as she crossed the battlement to the stairwell door, but just before she pulled it open, his voice came from behind her, low, carrying, completely calm. "You can't keep running," to Lyra Finch. She went through the door and pulled it shut behind her, and stood in the dark stairwell for 3 heartbeats, her back against the cold stone, the heat of his hand still present along her jaw, as though it had left a mark she couldn't see. Then she went down. In the dark of the stairwell, 2 steps above where she had been standing, a shadow that had been very carefully still drew back against the wall, and waited until the sound of her footsteps faded completely, and then moved. Chapter 4. The Midnight Visit. She was asleep when the door opened, not the knock before opening that even the most senior staff used when entering the servant quarters at night. Just the door, swinging inward, and candlelight entering the room before the person carrying it did, filling the space with a soft, warm glow that was somehow the most threatening thing Lyra had seen in a very long time. She came awake in pieces, the light first, then the cold draught from the open door, then the particular quality of the silence that falls when everyone in a room has woken up and decided, without speaking, that making any sound is a mistake. Lady Gundred stood in the doorway. Lady Gundred Hobbs, in her dark silk robe, with her hair pinned back, and her face wearing the particular expression of someone who is accustomed to entering any room she chooses, at any hour she chooses, because the castle was hers, and everyone in it was hers, and the concept of privacy was something she extended or withheld at her discretion. She was holding a single candle. The flame was very still in the airless room. Kathleen had sat up on her cot, but Lyra could see her in the edge of her vision, rigid, suddenly wide awake, the humour completely gone from her face. Lorena was frozen in the corner, her knees drawn up, her eyes fixed on Lady Gundred with the expression of someone who has just understood that they are witnessing something they should not be witnessing. Lady Gundred's gaze moved across the room, slowly, taking inventory, until it reached Lyra and stopped her. "Get up," she said. Her voice was low, almost gentle. This was the version of her that Lyra had learned to fear most. Lyra stood. She stood barefoot on the cold stone floor in her sleeping clothes, with her hair loose and her eyes still adjusting to the candlelight, and she waited, because waiting was the only useful thing available to her. But Lady Gundred stepped fully into the room and let the door fall mostly closed behind her. She moved her candle in a slow arc, taking in the 3 cots, the small chest at the foot of each one, the single window with its warped wooden shutter. She moved like someone who owns time and knows it. Her eyes returned to Lyra. "You know why I'm here," she said. "No, ma'am." Lady Gundred tilted her head very slightly. "That is a lie." She walked forward 1 step, 2, until she was close enough that the candlelight between them threw shadows across both their faces. "I know what happened on the battlements tonight. I know every word that was said." She paused, letting that settle. "And you are standing there, believing it means something for you." The room was absolutely silent. Kathleen had stopped breathing. Lyra could feel it. Lady Gundred's voice remained low, remained almost gentle. Each sentence landed separately, the way stones land when someone is building something. "You are an orphan with no name that matters. You came to this estate at 8 years old with nothing and no one. There is no family to ask where you are. There is no record that connects you to anything outside these walls." A pause. "Men like Marmon Richmond do not see women like you. You are the ground beneath his feet. You are the stone he steps on without looking down. You are the hand that pours his wine while his eyes are fixed on something that was built for him." She stopped. The candle flame between them was absolutely still. "You could work these floors on your knees for the rest of your life," Lady Gundred continued, her voice softening further, which was worse, "and he would never know your name. That is where you belong. That is the only place that exists for you." A very small pause. "And somehow tonight you forgot that." Lyra stood very still. The cold from the stone floor had moved up through her feet and into her ankles, and was continuing its slow climb. She was aware of Kathleen on her cot, frozen and pale, aware of Lorena staring at the floor, aware of the ache in her ribs from 3 nights ago, still present, still reminding her of the slope in the Ashwood, of what happened when she went where she had no right to go. "You are going to take your things," Lady Gundred said. "You will leave this estate before first light." Her eyes held Lyra's without blinking. "Or I will make sure you do not leave at all. Choose." Lady Gundred turned her head toward Kathleen and Lorena. Her voice didn't change, didn't rise, didn't threaten with any force that would give you something to argue against. "As for the 2 of you, if a single word of what was said in this room leaves this room—" A small pause. "The East Dungeon has been empty for quite some time. It would be a shame to have a reason to fill it again." Kathleen went pale as linen. Lorena's eyes dropped to the floor. Lady Gundred looked at Lyra one final time, the look of someone confirming a decision already made. Then she turned and walked out of the room, taking the candlelight with her, and left everything in darkness. The silence that followed was its own kind of sound. Lorena moved first, slipping from her cot without a word, crossing the dark room to Lyra, and folding her arms around her with a fierceness entirely out of proportion to her size. Lyra stood inside it. She didn't move, because if she moved, something would happen that she couldn't afford. "You did nothing wrong," Lorena whispered. Lyra pulled back carefully. "Take care of yourself," she said. Her voice came out even. "Both of you." Kathleen made a sound from her cot that was not a word. Lyra pulled her small bundle from beneath the cot, the few things that were truly hers, which did not take long to gather because there had never been many, and walked to the door in the dark. She did not look back. If she had looked back, she would not have been able to leave, and leaving was the only thing she could do. The castle gate fell behind her. The stone road turned to dirt. The trees on either side closed in. "You are the ground he walks on. You are nobody. As there is no one who will ask where you are." She had known that for 15 years, hearing it said that way, in that room, in that voice, in front of Kathleen and Lorena, had changed the weight of it. The words followed her down the road like weather, settling on her shoulders, and she walked under them, because walking was the only thing available. The Ashwood rose dark on both sides. The moon was setting. She tightened her grip on her bundle, and kept moving. Chapter 5. He rides after her. He woke before dawn to nothing. Not a sound, not a movement, not any disturbance the ordinary senses could name. The wolf was simply on its feet inside him, alert and furious and scanning the dark in every direction at once, because something was wrong in the specific way that only one thing could be wrong. She was not in the castle. He was dressed and moving through the corridor before the thought had fully formed. He tested the air in the servant passages, the back stairs, the eastern courtyard. Her scent, that particular combination of cold stone and wood smoke, and something underneath that the wolf had memorized in the Ashwood clearing and hadn't released since, was faint and trailing, heading toward the main gate. And then, nothing. Past the gate, the trail thinned against the night air and the road beyond, but the direction was clear. She left. Or... He stood in the middle of the empty courtyard in the grey pre-dawn, the castle quiet around him. His jaw tightened once. Lady Gundred. He considered the probability for exactly 4 seconds. Then he went to the stables. Resno Cross was already there, one of his riders, too early by nature, practical by training, and he looked at Marmon crossing the stable yard alone before sunrise and said nothing, which was the correct response. Marmon saddled his own horse with quick, certain movements, and Resno asked no questions, and the gate opened, and he rode out into the grey morning on a road that smelled faintly of her presence, hours old. The trail was thin. Enough. His wolf tracked it the way it tracked everything that mattered, not frantically, but with the absolute patience of something that has decided it will find what it is looking for, and is simply completing the steps toward that certainty. The road stretched through open ground before entering the tree line. Dawn was assembling itself slowly above the Ashwood, pale gold beginning at the eastern edge of the sky. He pushed the horse faster. She heard the horse before she saw it. The road had been empty for the 2 hours she had been on it. No carts, no riders, no sound, except her own footsteps on the packed dirt and the occasional conversation of birds beginning in the trees above. She had fallen into the particular rhythm of someone covering ground with purpose, even when the destination wasn't yet clear. Her bundle under her arm, her eyes on the road, her mind doing the work of not going backward. There was a village 4 leagues ahead. There would be an inn, probably, or a kitchen that needed someone willing to work without asking questions. There was always work for someone who didn't ask questions. The hoofbeats came from behind, and her body knew what they meant before she had finished hearing them. She stopped in the middle of the road. Or she didn't run this time. She was too tired to run, and her ribs still remembered the Ashwood slope, and there was something in her that had simply reached the end of running as a strategy. The horse came around the bend and slowed, and Marmon dismounted while it was still moving, landing on the road with that familiar ease, and walking toward her with the same deliberate calm he brought to everything, unhurried, giving nothing away, his golden eyes finding hers. One corner of his mouth shifted. "You always run," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was almost gentle, which was harder to bear than an accusation. "Lady Gundred," she said. Not a question. "I thought so." He stopped a few feet from her. "Are you hurt?" "No." He looked at her for a moment, at the bundle under her arm and the worn shoes and the road she had been on since before dawn. Something moved behind his eyes that wasn't quite readable and wasn't quite hidden. "I told you I would handle it," he said. "You were asleep. I'm here now." She looked at him. At this man on a dirt road at dawn, who had ridden out of a castle before the sun rose to find a servant girl with mud on her shoes and nothing of value in her bundle, who was looking at her with the expression of someone who has finished arguing with themselves about something and is now simply done arguing. "Kathleen and Lorena," she said. "Lady Gundred threatened them. I need to know they'll be safe." "They will be." No hesitation. No qualification. Just the flat certainty of someone whose word has always been the last word. She looked at him a moment longer, or the sky above the Ashwood was turning from grey to gold, and the birds were getting louder, and the road was cold and long, and she had nowhere in particular to go. And he was standing in front of her, solid and real, and looking at her like she was the only fixed point in the landscape. "I don't know how to do this," she said quietly. "I don't know what any of this means, or what I'm supposed to." "You don't have to know yet," he said. He took a step closer. Close enough now that she could feel the warmth his presence gave off, even in the morning cold. "You only have to trust me. One step." She looked at him, at his face in the early light, the gold of his eyes, the steadiness in them, the complete absence of anything performed or strategic. Just a man on a road, asking her to trust him. She had trusted very few things in her life, and had been right to be cautious. She understood that. She also understood, with the quiet certainty of a person whose body has been trying to tell them something for days, that this was different. She closed the distance between them. It was not a dramatic thing. She simply stepped forward and put her hands against his chest and tilted her face up and let her eyes close. His hand found the side of her face immediately. Warm, careful, the same hand that had rested against her jaw on the battlement. And then his mouth found hers. The kiss was warm and certain, and completely quiet and entirely unhurried, the way it is when two people have been circling something for days and have finally stopped pretending they weren't circling it. When they broke apart, her eyes were still closed for a moment. "My wolf knew," he said. His voice was rougher than it had been. Lower. "Before I did. It knew in the clearing." She opened her eyes. "That is genuinely strange," she said. The laugh that came out of him was low and real and moved through his chest beneath her hands, and she thought, with the helpless clarity of someone whose defenses have just been comprehensively defeated, "I want to hear that again." He lifted her onto the horse and mounted behind her, and they rode back toward the estate as the sun fully cleared the horizon and the Ashwood lit gold on both sides of the road, and his arm was around her, steady and warm, and she didn't once tell herself to want less. Chapter 6. What Justice Looks Like. Lady Gundred was in her main hall when Marmon entered. Seated in her high chair, her posture flawless, her hands folded, her face wearing the mask she had constructed over many years of knowing that faces were architecture, not expression. She had not survived this long in this position by letting what she actually felt reach her features without invitation. Marmon didn't sit. "You sent her away," he said. Not an accusation, a statement of fact, establishing shared territory before what came next. Lady Gundred held his gaze with the practiced ease of someone who had held the gaze of difficult men before. "I made a decision I believed was in everyone's interest. You interfered with my mate." He said it the way the elders read pack law, each word given its full weight, and nothing hurried, nothing softened. "You are not a wolf, but you know what that means under the law of this pack. You have always known." A beat of silence. "I could end this conversation very differently than I'm going to," he said. "You are aware of that." Lady Gundred's mask didn't crack, but something behind it shifted. The eyes, the very faint tightening at the corners, the involuntary acknowledgement that this was not a negotiation. "I won't." He moved to the window, his back to her for a moment, looking out at the courtyard below where Lyra was with Resno and the horses. "Because she asked me not to. Because what she wants matters more to me than what you deserve." He turned back. "But you will lose the trade agreement with Doolin. All 3 terms dissolved. You will lose the eastern border allocation and the protection my riders provided your western road. My men will remain in this castle. Not for your safety, but so that I know what happens here." Lady Gundred was very still. "That is mercy," Marmon said. "It is mercy because she asked for it, not because you earned it." A long, charged silence. "Understood," Lady Gundred said at last. The word was exactly sized, not submission, not argument, just the acknowledgement of someone who knows when the ground has shifted permanently and is deciding how to stand on the new landscape. Marmon inclined his head, the smallest gesture, the courtesy due someone he was finished with. He left without another word. In the courtyard, Lyra was standing with Kathleen and Lorena. She had found them before he finished with Lady Gundred, had gone straight to the servant quarters with Resno beside her, and Kathleen had come out of the room at a run and nearly knocked her sideways with the force of her embrace, and Lorena had followed with her eyes suspiciously bright and her expression working very hard to stay composed. "I knew it," Kathleen said against her shoulder. "I knew it would work out." "You knew nothing," Lyra said. I knew everything. Kathleen pulled back and looked at her with shining eyes and the beginnings of an enormous smile. Are you leaving? I am. Kathleen's smile wavered for just a second. Then, and us? Lyra looked at the two of them. Kathleen, who had put her in the Ashwood with a bucket competition, and then stayed up all night with a candle burning, waiting for her to come home. Or Lorena, who had crossed a dark room to hold her when Lady Gundred left, and said you did nothing wrong in a whisper that had cost her more than it looked. You're coming with me, Lyra said. Lorena's mouth fell open. Ladies in waiting, Lyra said. If you want it. The silence lasted 2 full seconds. Then Kathleen laughed. A real laugh, a surprised one, the kind that comes out before you've decided whether to let it. And Lorena's composure stopped working entirely, and she gave up on it, and let the tears do what they were going to do. Marmon found them in the corridor later, and Lyra told him what she had done. He looked at her for a moment. You want your friends with you, he said. Yes. All right. She blinked. Just like that. I told you, he said, that you would have everything you wanted, or the way you wanted it. She looked at him. This man who said things like that, the way other people said things like it might rain tomorrow. Plainly, without decoration, as simple fact. Something in her chest turned over slowly. You know, she said, keeping her voice carefully level, when you say things like that, it becomes very difficult to keep pretending I don't. She stopped. He waited. That I don't trust you, she finished. The smile that moved across his face was slow and sure. That wasn't what you started to say. She turned away before he could see the color in her face, but she was smiling, and she didn't bother hiding that part. Chapter 7. The Bite, the Bond, the Truth about Lyra Finch. The mating ceremony took place on the first night in Starvale. Not in the Great Hall, not before the assembled pack. In the inner chamber of the castle, ancient stone, long candles in iron holders, the kind of room that had absorbed so much history that the walls themselves had a quality of attention, of witness. The elders stood in a semicircle, Aldrich Turlough at the centre, flanked by Emmet Cross and Clyde Bonner, and 2 others whose names Lyra was still learning. Their faces held the particular stillness of people who understood they were present for something singular. No drums, no crowd, no ceremony built for spectacle, just this room, these candles, the 2 of them, standing opposite each other, in the warm, shifting light, and the silence between them that had weight and warmth and no emptiness in it at all. Are you going to run? Marmon asked, low, only for her. The corner of her mouth moved. Not this time. Aldrich Turlough began to speak. The language was old, older than the common tongue, each syllable carrying a density that made the air around it feel different, the way the air feels different inside a cathedral or beneath a very old tree. Lyra didn't understand the words. She didn't need to. They arrived in her bones before her ears translated them, settling into the deep places, the wordless ones, where things are understood without explanation. When the elder finished speaking, the silence changed. Marmon moved her hair from her shoulder, slowly. His fingers traced the curve of her neck with an attention that made the air in her lungs go very still. His eyes found hers. She nodded. The bite came like a wave. It started at the point of contact and moved outward in every direction at once. Through her chest, her arms, her spine, down to her fingertips, up through the back of her skull. Not pure pain. Something larger than pain, something that reorganized rather than simply hurt, as though every part of her was being rewritten from the inside in a language she had never known she already spoke. And inside that, something else, a presence, warm, ancient, pressing back through the bond from the other side with a certainty that left no room for doubt. His wolf, arriving through the connection that had just been made permanent, the way dawn arrives, not sudden, not gentle, simply inevitable and complete. She felt it know her. She felt it recognize her the way she had been recognized in the forest clearing, not searching, not considering, arriving. And something in her that had no name rose to meet it, equally certain, equally old, but as though it had been waiting for exactly this, for exactly as long as it had taken to reach here. Her legs stopped working. His arms were already there. "I've got you," he said. Very close. The bond between them moved soft and steady in her chest, a second heartbeat beside her own, warm and impossibly real. She let the dark come. She woke to morning, real morning, gold light through the high windows, landing in long, warm bars across the stone floor, the sound of birds somewhere outside, the particular quality of a new day that has not yet been complicated by anything. She stared at her hands. Something was different, not visible, not anything she could point to. But present. A new awareness she had no framework for, the air in the room carrying more information than it had before. At the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside, reaching her with a clarity that should not have been possible through thick stone walls. She could hear individual voices 2 floors below. She could smell the candles from last night, and the old stone, and him. He was in the chair beside the bed, not sleeping, just there, elbows on his knees, watching her with the expression of someone who has been awake all night and is making no apology for it. "How long?" she asked. "All night." She touched the mark on her shoulder with 2 fingers. The skin was smooth, already healed, already settled, already hers. She pressed gently, felt the pulse of the bond answer, soft, constant, like a thread connecting her to somewhere she had not known she was looking for. "I heard footsteps," she said, "through the walls, and voices, to 2 floors below. Yes, that's not—" She stopped. "That's not normal." "No," he said. "It isn't." Aldrich Turlough requested an audience before noon. He stood before Marmon in the council chamber, with Emmett Cross and Clyde Bonner flanking him, and the expression on his face was the expression of someone who has spent the night in an archive and emerged with something that changes every calculation. Lyra sat beside Marmon. She had asked to be present. He had said yes without hesitation, which was, she was learning, how he made all decisions that pertained to her. "We analyzed the ceremony through the night," Aldrich said. He chose his words with the care of a man who understands that words land differently on certain mornings. The bond formed unusually. The mark healed in under an hour. Her awareness of the surrounding environment expanded immediately upon waking. He paused. The aura she left in the chamber, we could feel it this morning, still present in the stone, is not a human aura. The room was very quiet. "We believe," Aldrich continued, "that she carries dormant bloodline, shifter blood, old blood, the kind that can go generations without waking if the circumstances never arose to wake it." He looked at Lyra directly, with the steady gaze of someone delivering news rather than a verdict. "You are not simply human. You have never been simply human. Something in your bloodline has been sleeping since before you were born." Lyra absorbed this. She had spent 15 years understanding exactly what she was: a servant, an orphan, a person without a name that mattered. She had built her entire life on the clarity of that understanding. She sat with what Aldrich had said, and felt it rearranging things quietly, systematically, like furniture being moved in a room she had lived in so long she had stopped seeing it. "And there is more," Emmett Cross said, leaning slightly forward. He looked at Marmon. "You walked into this chamber this morning, and every person in it felt it before you spoke. The alpha aura." He searched for the right scale. "It is not what it was yesterday. It is denser, more complete, as though something that was always present but partial has been finished." "She completed you," Aldrich said simply. "The bond with your mate amplified what was already there. We have read of this. We have never witnessed it." Marmon was quiet for a moment. Then, "Investigate her past, or everything, who her parents were, how she came to Lady Gundred's estate, who brought her there and why. Every record that exists." He stood. "When you find something, you come to me first." "We've already begun," Aldrich said. Marmon looked at Lyra. She looked back. Something passed between them. Not words, something below words, moving through the bond like warmth through a stone wall. She felt him there. Steady. Present. "Who are you?" she thought. Not to him. To herself. To the new information settling into the places where the old story used to live. She didn't have the answer yet. She suspected the answer was going to change everything. He found her in the garden later, sitting on a stone bench in a patch of morning sun, her eyes closed, her face tilted up toward the warmth, or the mark at her shoulder visible at the edge of her dress. He sat beside her without speaking. They stayed like that for a while, the garden quiet around them, the bond between them pulsing soft and steady, like something that had always been there and was only now visible. "The elders say you became stronger," she said, without opening her eyes. "It's true. Because of me. Because of you." A pause. "Are you all right with what Aldrich said?" She considered this honestly. "I don't know yet," she said. "Ask me in a week." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. She opened her eyes and looked at him, at his face in the full morning light, without firelight or candlelight or the particular drama of darkness to make things seem larger than they were. Just a man in a garden, sitting beside her because he chose to, because he had ridden out of a castle before sunrise to find her on a dirt road, because his wolf had stopped an entire ceremony and turned toward a servant girl hiding behind an oak tree with mud on her knees and a lost bet as her reason for being there, and had said, without any language, without any ceremony, "Her. Only her. Her." "I told you," he said quietly, "that you were not just a servant. You did." She was quiet for a moment. "I didn't believe you?" "I know. I'm working on it." He reached out and took her hand from her lap and held it. Easy, warm, not making anything of it. She turned her hand over and let her fingers close around his. "I have something to tell you," she said. "Tell me." "When Lady Gundred said those things, 'You are the ground he walks on, you are nobody,' I had heard all of it before. Different voices, different rooms. I had heard every version of that speech since I was 8 years old, and I had learned to agree with it, because agreeing with it was the safest strategy." She paused. But standing there that night, after everything, after the clearing and the courtyard and the battlements, I didn't agree with it anymore. She looked at him. I was angry, for the first time in a long time. Not sad, angry. He was watching her with full attention. "I want to know who I am," she said. "I want to know where I come from and why I was left at that estate, and what is sleeping in me that has never been awake." She tightened her fingers slightly around his. I want to know. Not because it changes what you think of me, but because I want to know for myself. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, simply, more completely, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. Then we'll find out. She looked at his face, at the gold of his eyes in the morning sun, steady and certain, and carrying no condition in them at all. She thought of the girl who had given herself the name Finch, because finches were small and fast and survived winters that killed larger birds. She thought of 15 years of making herself invisible, of wanting very little, of learning the edges of a life that was never intended to fit her. She thought of an oak tree at the edge of a clearing and 4 bonfires, and a man stopping mid-step because something in him had turned toward the dark between the trees and found what it was looking for. She had run. She had fallen down a slope. She had been expelled from the only home she knew in the middle of the night with a bundle of things that didn't amount to much, and she was sitting here in a garden full of morning light, holding the hand of the Alpha King of the Doolin pack, with 2 friends being fitted for new dresses 2 floors above her, and a mark on her shoulder that pulsed like a second heartbeat, and something ancient and sleeping beginning to stir in the deepest part of her, waking slowly to a world that was larger than anything she had been permitted to want. Lyra Finch, who had made herself small for 15 years, who had learned invisibility like a second language, who had lost a bet on a spring afternoon and stumbled into the Ashwood with mud on her knees, and no idea that a pair of golden eyes were about to refuse, permanently and entirely, or to look away, leaned her head against Marmon Richmond's shoulder in the warm morning sun. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, she let herself take up exactly as much space as she needed. The garden was quiet around them. The bond between them pulsed, soft, warm, alive, and absolutely permanent. And somewhere in the archive, 3 floors below, Aldrich Turlough turned the page of a very old record and found a name, and went very still. To be continued.